Dear learners, welcome to the massive open online course on Public Financial Administration. Today in this class, we are going to see public debt and its impact. I am your instructor for today and I am Dr. Shobana Karthikeyan, Assistant Professor, Department of Economics, Madras Christian College. So, before we actually move in, let us see what are the learning goals for today. We start off with the meaning and definition of public debt and understand why nations have to actually borrow. Why is it that they cannot make do with just their public revenue? So, what are the different types of public liability in India? Public liability in India can be divided into two basically: the debt contracted against the Consolidated Fund of India and the public account. The next one we move on is to the debt GDP ratio. And then we also look at questions of what exactly is a healthy debt GDP ratio and what is dangerous for an economy. So moving on from there, we also see what is meant by the debt, external debt to GDP ratio. We also analyze what are the figures for the several Indian states, because not all states are equal. Their revenue generating capacities are equal. Their debts are also not equal. So that is something we have to see as well. So, general debt classification of public debt. So, consequences of debt or the burden of debt. What happens to an economy when a debt is contracted? The next question we actually turn to is about whether debt, when contracted, only affects the present generation or it affects the future generation as well. So, moving on, we understand what exactly is meant by deficit. And we also see the interaction between deficit, debt and economic growth. The next thing we do turn to is deficit financing, and we look at the various types of deficits. Deficits broadly are of four types: revenue deficit, budgetary deficit, fiscal deficit and primary deficit. We not only see what each one is made up of, we also see the importance of each of these on the economy. We finally stop to analyze the trends in deficits today, and then we would recap and we would close the course today. Moving on, what exactly is meant by public debt? Public debt is any debt that is contracted by a government. A government could mean at the local government, at the state level or at the central level. So, when public debt is incurred when a government floats loans and borrows either internally from the people within the country or externally through outside sources. So, this in a broad sense, when we are going to look at public debt, it also construes future public expenditure. It can also be looked at from the angle of future public expenditure, because any loan that is taken by any level of the government has to be repaid with interest. It is obligatory on the part of the government to pay the interest at the appointed time. Therefore, it definitely constitutes future public expenditure. One thing about a public debt is that it is not a compulsory source of public receipt. Now, why does a government at any level have to even borrow? Is the revenue that it generates, is it not enough to run its affairs? So there are three major reasons why public debt can actually happen. One, to meet a budget deficit. Number two, to take care of any emergencies such as war or any extraordinary situations. If we can recall, the COVID-19 pandemic was an extraordinary situation, and that had to be taken care of definitely with a debt. To finance developmental activity, and by looking at these three, financing developmental activity is one of the most encouraging reasons why a state can borrow. Moving on, how does the government of India define public debt? So, the Article 266(1) of the Indian Constitution defines public debt as those of its liabilities which are contracted against the Consolidated Fund of India. So, this is a very important term that has to be defined now. So, what exactly is the Consolidated Fund of India? So, this is the account where this is the debt contracted against the Consolidated Fund of India, which is actually called the public debt. Now, the Consolidated Fund of India is a huge spreadsheet of all incomes and expenditures that the central government or all the governments put together actually perform. So, the Consolidated Fund of India derives its name from the Constitution of India. So, Article 266(1) of the Constitution of India says the Consolidated Fund of India comprises of all revenues, both taxation and non-tax revenues that are received by the Union government, and all loans raised by the issue of treasury bills, internal and external loans, and all money received by the Union government in the repayment of loans. So, all of these funds together constitutes the Consolidated Fund of India. Now, under Article 266(1), the Consolidated Fund of India is also maintained separately for each state. So, the government has a very clear demarcation between whether the debt belongs to the state or states, or whether the debt belongs to the Union government. So, this one, the debt by the Union government and the states together is the Consolidated General Government Debt. This speaks about the overall debt of the central and the state governments put together. Now, you can imagine how big a number it is going to be. Every single penny that the government, both at the union and at the state, takes in the form of a loan is going to be the total debt of the country. The second of such accounts which are important is the public account. The public account is defined under the Article 266(2) of the Indian Constitution. It says, all public money other than those which are credited to the Consolidated Fund of India, which is received on behalf of the government, shall be credited to the public account of India. So, this is a very important thing. So, what exactly is it made up of? So, we can understand that whenever the government acts as a custodian of your money and my money, for example, we are going to park our money with the National Savings, Small Savings Fund, or the Defence Fund, or any bank savings that we have under various ministries or departments, or for example, National Investment Fund, or National Calamity and Contingency Fund, or Provident Fund, Postal Insurance Fund. All of this money goes into the public account. A point to note here is that in the case of a public account, the government merely acts as a custodian of the money. It does not own it. The money still belongs to the public. That is why it's called the public account. The government is merely a custodian of this money. Now, a chief difference between the Consolidated Fund of India and the public account is that if money has to be withdrawn from the Consolidated Fund of India, the parliamentary approval is needed. In this case, in the case of a public account, because the money anyway belongs to the people, no such parliamentary approval is needed. So, on demand, money can actually be withdrawn. So, the government does not need permission to take advances from this account. Each state, again, just as the Consolidated Fund of India operates, even in the case of a public account, each state has its own similar accounts. A commonality between the Consolidated Fund of India and the public account is that both of this has to be audited by the CAG of India, who is the Comptroller and Auditor General of India. So, moving on, we have seen what exactly public debt, the magnitude of public debt, why it is important, why nation states borrow and things like that. So, the question that we need to ask ourselves is are governments going to borrow indefinitely, or how much borrowing is considered healthy, or when does it get dangerous, and if the borrowing is going to become too much, is it going to hamper economic growth? These are certain questions that we actually ought to answer at this point. So, an important statistic that we need to understand here is the debt to GDP ratio. So, all the debt that is contracted by the country, if it is divided by the gross domestic product of the country, you arrive at a ratio called the debt GDP ratio. Loosely, it can be understood as if all of the income of the country is to be put away separately, how long is it going to take to pay its debt? So it is usually spoken in the form of percentages. A very low debt to GDP ratio is not considered healthy because there is really no incentive for the government to grow. There's nothing that's actually happening that it is taking that debt. So a very low debt to GDP ratio is usually not considered healthy. And too much of it, 2 times, 3 times of the GDP, if the debt is going to be 2 or 3 times of the GDP, then again it's not considered healthy. It's too much. It means that the government has borrowed too much according to its current capabilities. So what exactly can be considered a healthy debt to GDP ratio? If we will just see, so we arrive at the concept of good versus bad debt to GDP ratios. A study of the World Bank found that those countries whose debt to GDP ratios exceeded 77% for prolonged periods of time, they are going to pay in terms of loss of economic growth. So typically speaking, there is a statistic released by the World Bank that says that beyond 77%, if the debt to GDP ratio increases, it is going to cost economies 0.017% in economic growth. Now, this threshold of 77% is for general countries and not for emerging economies. The threshold is slightly at a reduced level for emerging economies, where when there is an additional percentage point of debt over 64% annually, it actually eats up economic growth by 0.02%. So you can definitely see that there's a clear trade-off between debt taken and economic growth. Yes, so now we move on to understanding how the world economies are performing when it comes to debt to GDP ratios. These statistics are fairly latest, so they are 2023 statistics. The country that is on top here is at about more than 250%. The debt to GDP ratio is Venezuela, followed by Japan at 237%, Singapore is at 126%, Bhutan at 110%, and United States at 107%. So moving on, we do see that India is at 69.62%, Qatar is at 65.8%, and there are several statistics of key countries that I have put together, and you can definitely see these. So countries which actually headed from the bottom are Brunei at 2.4%, Cayman Islands at 5.7%, Afghanistan at 7.1%. So you cannot necessarily say that a low debt to GDP ratio is actually good for the country. So it could be a case where important key infrastructure projects, key developmental projects are actually not being undertaken, or in other words, debt is not being undertaken to finance those. So we now move on. So all along we were talking about debt to GDP ratio. So now we understand what exactly is the burden of external debt, typically which is measured by the debt service ratio. So the debt service ratio speaks about a country's repayment obligations of principal and interest, that is the debt servicing portion, for a particular year on its external debt as a percentage of its exports of goods and services. So exports is what gets the revenue, the international revenue for the country. So this one talks about, so how much of the country's repayment obligation, you talk about it in the form of exports, in terms of exports. So generally it is considered any amount, any percentage from 0 to 20 as a healthy debt service ratio. So we can see that except for a few periods from 2014 to 14, 15, 16 and 2021, our external debt to GDP ratio is pretty much below 20%. The present ratio is at about 18.85%. So India is a composition of several states. All states do not act similarly. The states have their own historical backgrounds, their own revenue generation models, and so this reflects in the debt to GSDP ratios for Indian states, because the revenue generation capacity of the states is not the same, their expenditures is not the same. So therefore, the debt that each state takes is also not going to be the same. So therefore, if we now come to an important statistic, which is the debt to GSDP ratio for Indian states. So how do we compute the debt to GSDP ratio? It's very easy. You have the debt that is taken by the state government. In the denominator, you have the gross state domestic product, so which is what the government of every particular state generates over a financial year into 100. So that will be the simple metric that is used to understand the debt to state GDP ratio. So if we will see the projected GDP ratio in Arunachal Pradesh is 53, in Punjab it's 46.8, so Arunachal Pradesh is at the highest, Bihar is at 37.8 and Mizoram is also at 37.8. Among the South Indian states, Kerala is at about 36.6, Andhra Pradesh is at 33.3 and Tamil Nadu is at about 25.6 and Karnataka is at 23 and Odisha is probably at the lowest at 13.1%. So again, as I was just mentioning, the revenue generation capacity of the states is not the same, their expenditures are also not the same. So the need for a debt is also not the same for various states. So what are the factors affecting a variation in the debt to GSDP ratio? So there are a few factors here. One is the economic disparity. The second is the fiscal policies that states decide to pursue, the demographic factors, external shocks, political decisions and inherent regional disparities which governments have inherited from time immemorial. So we will see these factors one after the other. So when you talk about economic disparities, we did see a very clear relationship that states with higher GSDPs tended to have a lower debt to GSDP ratio. So states with smaller GSDPs actually have a higher debt to GSDP ratio. The next one is about the fiscal policies. Prudent fiscal policies can have a huge bearing on how states can actually handle themselves and their debts. So if any state is going to go after freebies for appeasement or for anything, depending on the political climate of every state, the fiscal policy is going to be a huge impacting factor of the debt to GSDP ratio. The third one is the demographic factors. So what is the kind of population that certain states house? So for example, states like Uttar Pradesh have a sizable chunk of population, so which means that their expenditure needs are also going to be greater. And if you take states like Maharashtra, where there is a huge influx of population from neighboring states migrant population, particularly in search of education, work or anything, they also have to shell out a lot. Their expenditure is also going to be quite a lot. So the next one is about external shocks, natural disasters and economic shocks may lead to increased borrowing in the case of certain states. For example, there is an earthquake, there is a flood, there are certain flood prone zones. Some states comfortably get away with not much of it, thankfully. The next one is about political decision. Governance quality impacts responsible debt management. Some states do tend to look at populist schemes in order to garner more votes in the elections. So naturally, there is going to be a huge dent on the exchequer in that case. So there is a greater need for them to take a greater debt also in the coming years. So the next one is about regional disparities that states actually inherit from previous governments. Variations in regional economic conditions, historical debt burdens add to the already existing complexity of the situation. So this is something that has to be understood. What are the factors that affect variation in debt to GSDP ratios of various Indian states? So when we do look at public debt, so what are the types of debt that governments can actually contract? We have a classification of public debt. They can be broadly divided into about 7 types. One is the internal and external debt, short-term and long-term debt, funded and unfunded debt, voluntary and compulsory debt, redeemable and irredeemable debt, productive or reproductive, or unproductive or dead weight debt. The next one is marketable versus non-marketable debt. We will be seeing each of these debts in detail. The first one is about internal and external debt. The question here is very clear as to who is the person or the entity from whom the government has actually borrowed money. So, in the case of an internal debt, we are going to talk about money being borrowed from an internal entity or somebody who belongs to the country. So, that is your internal debt. If the money is being paid, has to be repaid to a foreigner or a foreign institution, then it is an external debt. So, internal debt refers to the government loans floated in the capital markets within the country, and such a debt is going to be subscribed by individuals or corporations or institutions, entities that are belonging to the country. External debt is when a public loan is floated in the foreign capital market or outside the country. People who actually subscribe to this are foreign governments, foreign nationals, foreign institutions, banks. Then you call it an external debt. The next classification is how long or what is the duration of the debt. So here you're going to talk about a short-term debt or a long-term debt. So this classification, the previous classification was based on who is actually loaning the amount, whether it's an local entity or somebody belonging to the country or somebody belonging outside. So here it is about the duration of the debt undertaken. So most government debt is held in short-term interest-bearing securities. So usually if it is less than 90 days, ways and means advances or maturity period of a treasury bill is within 90 days, then you call it a short-term debt. So any debt which is longer than that can be classified as a long-term debt. So any debt which is exceeding 1 year or more or 5 years or more, debts that are undertaken for large projects, infrastructural projects or huge projects, all those debts are considered long-term in nature. The third classification is about funded or unfunded debt. So funded debt is the loan repayable after a long period of time, usually more than a year. And unfunded debt is a short-term loan that is taken. So in the case of a funded debt, the government maintains a separate fund which is called, so that's why this loan gets the name, the funded debt. In the case of an unfunded debt, no such an account is maintained. The money or the loan is going to be paid out of the general revenue or the general pool of money. It is also called as a floating debt. This is a short-term debt by its very nature. The next one is about voluntary or compulsory loans. Loans or any debt by its very nature is voluntary in nature. But in certain dire circumstances that a government is facing, like a war or any natural calamity or anything, sometimes it can force its citizens to loan a certain amount of money to the government as well. So that will be a compulsory loan. Of course, it's a little misnomer that loan, while it is voluntary in nature, is also being a compulsory loan. I mean, the words do not go together quite well, but yes, that's also a type that, at least in theory, it definitely exists. The next one is redeemable or irredeemable debt. Redeemable debt are the terminable loans. So the end site of the loan is actually known. So at the maturity period, whatever is agreed upon by the person who is seeking the loan and the person who has loaned the money, so the lenders will be paid the interest and the principal based on the obligations of the contract. So if that is not there, only interest is going to be paid year on year. There is no sight of the loan actually coming to a close. We are going to talk about an irredeemable debt. That is what is going to be called an irredeemable public debt. So as we can very easily say, an irredeemable public debt is not going to be preferred as much as the redeemable public debt, because people not only care for the interest amount, they also care for the principal that they parted with in the first place. The next one is about productive or reproductive or unproductive or deadweight debt. So we will first see what it means to be talking about a productive or a reproductive debt. So if a debt is taken to strengthen the economy in such a way that it is going to add to the GDP producing capability of the country, you're talking about a productive debt. So the productive debt is eventually going to add to the productive capacity of the nation. So you're for example, you're going to invest in education, you're investing in agriculture, in research and development, in industry. All of this is actually going to increase the productive capacity of the nation in the coming years. Such a debt is going to be called as the productive debt. So this adds to the productivity, it adds to the productive capacity of the nation. Therefore, a productive debt is definitely preferred over an unproductive debt. So moving on, so the exact opposite must be true for an unproductive debt. An unproductive debt does not mean that the debt is unimportant. It is just that it is not going to add to the productive capacity of the nation. For example, when you're talking about refugee rehabilitation or a famine relief work or anything, it definitely is important, but it does not really add to the productive capacity. So for example, loans on financing war can be considered an unproductive debt. So an unproductive debt is also called as a dead weight debt. So moving on, the next classification we have is that of a marketable and a non-marketable debt. So debt instruments that are traded, that can be traded, are called as marketable debt. So if there is no secondary market for a debt, and if it can only be redeemed on maturity, you call it a non-marketable debt. A non-marketable debt is still important because it can be used as a collateral for raising loans, but it just cannot be traded. So transfer of title cannot happen in the case of a non-marketable debt. In other words, holders cannot sell their rights to anybody else. There is no secondary market that is available for those debts, but they can be used as a collateral for raising loans from other financial institutions. So that is something, because anyway there is an underlying promise to get a money at a given point of time. So that can be used to raise money in other financial institutions. So this is with marketable and non-marketable debt. So we have seen the various classifications of debt until now. Now we will move on to understanding what are the consequences of debt, or in which way does a debt burden the economy. There are three major ways in which debt actually burdens an economy. One, there are efficiency and welfare losses arising out of taxation. The taxation is taken in order to pay off the debt. So taxation has to be increased in order to pay off the debt. Any tax by its very definition is a distortion to the existing state of affairs in an economy. So efficiency and welfare losses are inevitable. That is point number one. Number two, it is about capital displacement or the crowding out effect. Whenever the government comes in and competes for the limited existing pool of money from the people who are willing to lend, it raises the interest for everybody in the economy. So this is a deterrent to private investment. This is what is called as crowding out effect in economics. The third one is, because there is a debt that exists, because the debt has to be repaid with interest, debt servicing is an important part of public debt. Therefore, it slows the rate of growth of the economy. When we were discussing debt to GDP ratio, this was also one of the points that we were discussing. When debt becomes too much to handle, it actually applies brakes on the growth of the economy. When the economic growth is compromised, living standards ultimately fall for everybody in the economy. So we will see this in clear detail. The first effect that we are going to talk about is efficiency and welfare losses arising out of taxation. So any taxation, as I was just mentioning, is a distortion to the existing state of affairs. So it adversely affects the decision to invest or not to invest, the decision to buy a car or not to buy a car, the decision to go ahead and expand a business or not to expand, the decision to work and save or abstain from work and saving. Therefore, it is a clear distortion to the existing state of affairs in an economy. So, this distortion is also called as again a deadweight loss. It is an efficiency loss. It brings about lower well-being for the entire economy. So, there are very clear efficiency and welfare losses arising out of taxation. This taxation has to be increased in order to pay off the debt. So, the debt causes taxation, taxation causes further distortion. This distortion takes off or sponges out welfare from the people in the economy. The second thing that we have to see here is capital displacement on account of the crowding out effect. If the government borrows money from the people by selling bonds, there is a diversion of the society's limited pool of money. So, this would have otherwise gone to the private sector. The private sector would have gone about with its expansion plans or whatever. But when the government vies for the limited pool of money, there is too much competition. Therefore, this raises the interest rates for all borrowers in the economy. This effect is what is called as the crowding out effect in economics. So, very clearly, private capital formation takes a huge beating when we are going to talk about public debt. So, that is the second one. As Paul Samuelson rightly puts it, perhaps the most serious consequence of a large public debt is that it displaces capital from the nation's stock of wealth. As a result, the pace of the economic growth and the future standard of living falls, it declines, therefore, the economy becomes dimmer. So, this is one of the most important and deleterious effects of public debt. Moving on, we do talk about public debt. When there is public debt, it has to be serviced year on year. So, this acts as a huge growth retarding factor. Private to public sector limited capital flow anyway happens. So, private sector does not flourish as much as it should have. So, this is a huge deterrent as far as economic growth is concerned. So, output and consumption will grow more slowly in the presence of a large public debt than without it. So, these are the three important consequences of public debt. So, as again to quote Paul Samuelson and Northis, a large government debt tends to reduce a nation's growth in potential output because it displaces private capital, increases the inefficiency from taxation, and forces a nation to service the external portion of the debt. Once a debt is taken, there is no escaping from all these consequences. So, with this, we move on to a very critical question. If debt actually burdens the present generation, or does it have anything to do with the future generation as well? So, there are two components to it. So, where does the resource withdrawal come from? If the resource withdrawal comes from today's consumption, we say that the present generation is going to be affected. It affects my today's decision of buying something or not buying something, my today's decision of eating out or not eating out, whether to pursue something or not. But if the resource withdrawal happens, or it takes out from my capital formation or from my savings, then it is going to have a huge impact on the future generation, because the future generation is going to inherit a smaller capital. When they inherit a smaller capital, their flowing income from the capital also tends to diminish. So, therefore, the question whether debt affects the present generation or the future generation is a very pertinent question. So, the answer today to this is that if the resource withdrawal happens from the present day consumption, the present is affected. If the resource withdrawal happens from capital formation, the future generations are affected. So, to put all this together, we have to understand the interaction between deficit, debt and economic growth. So, when you take any budget for that matter, a deficit is any one situation for a budget. A budget could be either a surplus budget, a budget could be balanced where the revenue equals its expenditure, or the third case of a deficit where revenue is not enough to meet its expenditure. So, whenever there is a deficit that incurs year on year, there is definitely a problem because a debt has to be taken to tide over the deficit, and when a debt is taken, an interest has to be paid on it. So, whenever there is a debt that exists, interest costs definitely come up, and therefore this adds to the nation's stock of debt in the economy. Therefore, it brings down the levels of economic growth in any economy. So, this is the interaction as far as the deficits, the debt and the economic growth is concerned. So, to summarize this point, every year when there is a deficit that actually happens, the deficit adds on to the existing debt. So, this in turn has to be serviced. This therefore knocks off a small portion, although, of the economic growth. It knocks down economic growth and therefore brings down the levels of standard of living of the people of the economy. So, moving on to a very important point, we are going to talk about deficit financing. So, to conclude this discussion on debt, we saw in this lecture what exactly is meant by public debt. So, how does public debt work in India? We did see that public liability in India is divided into the Consolidated Fund of India and the public account. We also saw the various types of ratios, for example, the debt GDP ratio or the external debt to GDP ratio. We very briefly touched upon how debts work for the various states of India. So, that is the debt to state GSDP ratio. We also saw a general classification of public debt, followed by the consequences of public debt on a country, and eventually we did see the debt deficit economic growth interaction. So, how all of these interact. In the upcoming lecture, we will be taking up deficit financing, the various types of deficits and other things. Thank you so much.